My daughter told me her engagement party was already over and I should not concern myself. The words felt colder than the wind off the harbour. I had quietly set aside $100,000 to help her start her new life. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table, staring at the envelope that was supposed to be hers. What I discovered next would not only change how I saw my children, but force me to decide who truly deserved the best of what I had left to give. That morning began like most others in my small harbour town. The gulls were already circling over the docks, their cries sharp in the crisp air. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, the steam curling in the shaft of sunlight that came through the window. On the counter sat the envelope, plain and unmarked, but heavy with the weight of what it held. $100,000. Months ago, I had decided it would be my gift to Lila on her wedding day, a way to give her a safe start, to show that no matter how strained things felt, I still believed in her future. The house was quiet, except for the slow tick of the wall clock. I had lived here for over 40 years, first with Donald and later alone after he passed. Every creak of the floorboards was familiar. Every faded photograph on the wall told a piece of my story. I kept busy with my work at the library before retiring, and later with small routines that made the days feel steady. But the truth was, I had been holding on to the idea that family could be mended with the right gesture, the right moment. I looked at the calendar pinned to the fridge. Lila's engagement party should have been coming up. I had been waiting for an invitation, telling myself it would arrive any day. This was the day I planned to call her, to hear her excitement, to feel included. I poured another cup of tea, steadying myself for what I hoped would be a warm conversation. The phone call was short. Leela's voice was calm, almost too calm, as she told me the party had already happened, and there was no need for me to worry about it. For a moment, I thought I had misheard. But her words settled in quickly, cold and matter-of-fact. The tea in my hand no longer felt warm. I said goodbye, set the phone down, and stared at the envelope again. That money, that plan, had been my way of staying connected. Now it sat there between us like a wall I had not expected to build. I pushed back from the table and walked to the front window. Outside, the harbour was alive with small fishing boats heading out. Neighbours walked their dogs along the shore path, waving to each other, sharing small talk. I had once imagined being part of that same easy rhythm with my own children. But in that moment, I felt like a visitor in my own life, watching connections happen somewhere else. I spent the rest of the morning in small, deliberate movements, washing the breakfast dishes, folding the dish towels, straightening the books on the shelf in the living room. My hands worked automatically while my mind circled the same thought. Something had shifted a long time ago, and I had not seen it clearly until now. Lila's choice to leave me out of that day was not sudden. It was the result of many smaller choices, the kind that chip away at closeness until the distance feels normal. By late afternoon, the light over the harbour had turned softer. I sat back at the table, the envelope still in its place. I rested my hand on it, not to open it, but to feel its weight. The idea of giving it away no longer felt simple. It was no longer just about generosity. It was about trust, and whether that trust was still alive between us. As the day faded, I found myself wondering about the path ahead. That envelope could change a life, but it could also enable patterns that had left me on the outside looking in. I knew I would have to decide soon, and that the choice would not be as quiet as I had once imagined. Sometimes, the hardest part is realizing that love alone is not enough to keep you at the center of someone's life. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. I did not sleep well that night. The call with Lila replayed in my mind in fragments, the tone of her voice more than the words themselves. Calm, polite, but with a layer of distance I could not ignore. By morning, I had decided to go about my day as planned, hoping that movement might quiet my thoughts. The harbour was grey with an early fog, and I pulled my sweater tight as I walked to the market for fresh bread and vegetables. Along the way, I ran into a few familiar faces, neighbours, who waved and made small talk about the weather and the fishing season. I smiled and responded, though my attention kept drifting back to the phone call. Back home, I unpacked the groceries and placed them neatly in the kitchen. The house was still and cool, the kind of quiet that had been comfortable once, but lately seemed heavier. I tried to focus on small tasks, folding laundry in the living room while the radio murmured in the background. It was mid-morning when I decided to drive to the community centre. They were hosting a small open house for local programs, and I thought it might be a good distraction. The main hall smelled faintly of coffee and baked goods, tables lined with brochures and handmade crafts. I recognized a few of the volunteers from my library days and stopped to catch up. Toward the back of the room, I noticed Lila standing with Brian, speaking to a man I did not recognize. He was dressed neatly, holding a leather folder under one arm. They were leaning in close, talking in low voices. I slowed my steps, instinct telling me to keep a distance. Lila's posture was animated, her hand gesturing towards something in the folder, while Brian nodded with that half-smile he used when he thought he had the upper hand in a conversation. I turned toward the refreshment table, not wanting to intrude, but I caught my own reflection in the window. It struck me how natural they looked together in that moment, how seamlessly they moved in a shared conversation without me. A few minutes later, they began moving toward the exit. I stayed where I was, hidden by the angle of the tables. The man shook their hands before stepping outside, leaving Lila and Brian to speak quietly for another moment before heading out as well. I noticed Lila's expression soften into something almost satisfied, the corners of her mouth lifting slightly before she glanced toward the parking lot. I left soon after, the image of the three of them fixed in my mind. There had been no greeting, no acknowledgement, just the simple fact that I had been there, unseen. On the drive home, the air in the car felt close, the windows fogging slightly as the heater ran. I replayed the way Lila had spoken to me the day before, the way she had spoken to that man today. When I arrived home, I made tea and sat at the kitchen table, the envelope still where I had left it. The weight of it felt different now, as if the paper inside had absorbed the unease that had been building. I thought about the years since Donald passed, how I had tried to keep the family connected, how often I had overlooked small signs of distance because I wanted to believe the bond was still there. That afternoon, I went about my chores with a new restlessness. I polished the brass knobs on the cabinets, wiped down the counters twice, straightened the chairs around the dining table. Each task left my hands busier, but my mind sharper. The quiet between us was no longer just absence. It felt like space being deliberately held, a gap maintained for reasons I could not yet name. By evening, the fog had lifted over the harbour, the water catching the gold of the setting sun. I stood at the window for a long time, watching the tide shift. There was no message from Lila, no sign from Brian, only the familiar sound of the clock ticking and the low hum of the refrigerator. I understood then that the engagement party was only part of the story. Something else was moving beneath the surface, something I had not been invited to see. And though I did not yet know what it was, I could feel it pressing against the edges of my quiet life, waiting to come in. 2 days later, the weather had turned sharp and clear, the kind that made the air smell of salt and pine. I was in the driveway, sweeping away the layer of dry leaves that had gathered overnight, when I heard a car door close at the curb. Brian's voice carried over before I even looked up. He was leaning against his truck, phone pressed to his ear, his tone clipped but eager. I stayed where I was, the broom still in my hands. The sound of his voice had a pull to it, a mixture of business and something I could not quite name. I caught the name Cole, followed by phrases that made my grip on the broom tighten. He mentioned square footage, harbour views, and something about a quick turnaround. Then he said it plainly enough for the words to settle like a weight in my chest. The house on the water. It was the way he said it, as if the decision had already been made. My house, the place where I had lived most of my life, where every corner held pieces of a story Donald and I had built together. I stepped quietly toward the side of the driveway, close enough to catch more without being seen. Brian's voice lowered as he mentioned Lila, saying she was on board and that timing would be everything. He laughed once, short and dry, then said he would call back after he met with her later that afternoon. When the truck pulled away, I stood in the driveway a moment longer, the broom resting against my leg. The sound of the gulls overhead felt sharper, the air colder. My first instinct was to believe I had misunderstood, but the precision in his tone, the ease with which he spoke about it, told me otherwise. I went inside and sat at the kitchen table, hands flat against the wood. The envelope was still there, exactly where it had been for weeks, but I no longer saw it the same way. That money had been meant for Lila's future, for something that would lift her into stability and happiness. Now I could not ignore the thought that perhaps she and Brian had already decided how my future would be shaped, without asking. The rest of the morning moved slowly. I tried to focus on the small rituals that usually grounded me. I set bread to rise, watered the plants in the sunroom, organized the stack of mail on the counter. But every so often, Brian's words would slip back into my mind, the sound of his voice when he said harbour views. By noon, I found myself driving toward the library, the one I had worked in for decades before retiring. The familiar scent of old books and polished wood was a comfort, and I greeted the staff still there. But even among the quiet aisles, my thoughts were elsewhere. I kept replaying that moment in the driveway, looking for a way it might mean something different than it seemed. I could not find one. Later, I walked the long route home along the harbour path. Fishing boats rocked gently at their moorings, and the tide was starting to move out. The water caught the sunlight in a way that made it hard to look at for too long. I thought about how many evenings Donald and I had stood on that same stretch of dock, planning out repairs to the house, talking about the years ahead. It struck me that the view Brian spoke about so casually was the same one we had treated as part of our family's history, not a line item to be marketed. When I reached home, I went straight to my desk and took out a notepad. I wrote down the date, the time, and every detail I remembered from Brian's conversation. His exact phrasing, where I could recall it, the pauses, the tone. I did not know yet what I would do with this, only that I needed to keep a record. That evening, the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke from a neighbour's fireplace. I sat by the window in the living room, looking out toward the harbour lights. The street was quiet, and the only movement came from the sway of the docked boats. I let my eyes rest on that view, the same one Brian had reduced to a selling point. In the stillness, I felt the first real edge of something new. It was not just suspicion anymore. It was the beginning of certainty. Whatever they were planning, it was already in motion, and though I did not yet know the scope of it, I knew I would have to find out before it reached my front door. The morning after hearing Brian's call, I woke before the sun. The house was still in shadow, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. I made coffee, but let it grow cold on the counter. My mind was somewhere else entirely. I sat in the living room, letting my eyes drift over the framed photographs along the mantel. In one, Lila was 8 years old, holding a seashell to her ear on the beach just down the road. In another, Brian stood next to Donald on the deck, both of them grinning after a morning of fishing. These moments had once been the center of my life. Now, looking at them, I felt the distance more than the closeness. I thought back to the last few years, to the dinners I was not invited to, the holidays celebrated without me. At first, there had always been a reason: travel schedules, limited seating, or the claim that they thought I would not enjoy the event. Over time, the reasons stopped coming. The invitations stopped too. I remembered Lila's college graduation, how proud I had felt sitting in the bleachers, waiting for her to walk across the stage. She had smiled for the cameras, but slipped away quickly afterward to join her friends. Brian had promised we would all meet later for dinner, but he called that evening to say plans had changed. I had told myself it was fine. I had told myself it was nothing. The truth was harder to face. Each absence had been a small cut, and over the years, the cuts had added up. Somewhere along the way, I had gone from being part of their lives to someone they informed after the fact. I stood and walked to the window, looking out toward the harbour. The water was calm, the boats shifting slightly in their moorings. I thought about how much of my life had been tied to this place. Donald and I had worked hard to keep this house, even when money was tight. We had believed it would always be the anchor for our family. But now I could see how fragile that belief was. If Brian and Lila were willing to discuss selling it without me, then they saw it as an asset, not a home. And if they could talk about it so easily, then this was not a new idea. It was something that had been considered, maybe even planned, for some time. The phone rang in the kitchen, breaking the stillness. I let it ring. I was not ready for conversation, not when the edges of my thoughts were this raw. Instead, I went to the hall closet and pulled out a small box where I kept personal papers. I set it on the dining table and began to sort through it. Birth certificates, tax records, letters Donald had written me when we were first married. I stopped when I found the folder labeled Home. Inside were the original purchase papers, the mortgage documents, and the insurance policies. I read through each page slowly, not because I expected to find anything I did not already know, but because touching those papers reminded me that this place was more than a number on a page. It was the work of decades, the backdrop to our entire family history. By the time I put the papers away, the day had shifted into a pale winter light. I poured a fresh cup of coffee and sat back down, my thoughts moving in steady circles. I could no longer pretend these moments of exclusion were accidental. They were part of a pattern, one I had ignored because it was easier than facing what it meant. I thought about the look on Lila's face at the community center, the way she had leaned toward that man with Brian. There had been no hesitation, no sign of discomfort. Whatever they were discussing, it was not new to them. It was only new to me. I stayed at the table until the harbour fog began to lift, revealing the outlines of the fishing boats heading out to sea. My coffee had gone cold again, but I barely noticed. I was still holding on to one thought, quiet, but steady. If this was the way they saw me now, then I had to start seeing the situation just as clearly. Pretending it was something else would not change what was already happening. In the stillness of that room, surrounded by the pieces of my life, I felt the shift. The first part of accepting the truth is stopping the effort to rewrite it. I could feel that effort leaving me. In its place was the beginning of something else, not yet fully formed, but certain enough to hold my attention. It was the understanding that I needed to see the whole of this, no matter how uncomfortable it became. That evening I sat in the kitchen with the overhead light casting a warm circle on the table. The folder of home papers was back in the closet, but the knowledge of what they meant stayed with me. I reached for the envelope that had been sitting in the same spot for weeks. It felt heavier now, as if the weight of the decision inside it had doubled. I had intended it for Leela, but my certainty in that choice had been shaken. I slid the envelope into my desk drawer, not to hide it, but to move it out of sight. The act was quiet, deliberate. It was the first time I had changed my mind without feeling the need to announce it to anyone. The decision was mine alone, and it needed no approval. The next morning I walked down to Patty's house. We had been neighbours for years, close enough to share morning coffee or borrow a tool from each other's garage. She answered the door with a mug in her hand and a surprised smile. I stepped inside and we sat at her kitchen table, the smell of toast lingering in the air. I told her about seeing Lila and Brian with the man at the community centre, about hearing Brian's conversation in my driveway. Patty listened without interrupting, her face steady, the way someone looks when they have already learned the lesson you are struggling with. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said only that it was time to start thinking about what I needed to protect. We talked for a while about her own experience with her younger sister, how she had been the one everyone leaned on until there was nothing left for herself. She told me that letting people take without boundaries does not teach love, it teaches entitlement. The words sat heavy in the room, but they rang true. Walking home, I noticed how sharp the air felt in my lungs. I thought about what Patty had said and realized I had been waiting for someone else to acknowledge the problem before I acted. That was a mistake I would not make again. Back at the house, I went straight to the hall closet and pulled out another box, this one smaller, filled with personal account information. I reviewed each folder, checking account balances, making notes about which ones had shared access and which ones did not. Brian's name was on an old joint account I had nearly forgotten about. Seeing it there sparked a wave of unease. I wrote it down with a circle around it. By midday, I had a list of what needed to be changed. I made myself a sandwich and ate it standing at the counter, the sound of the gulls outside filling the space where the radio usually played. I was not ready for music. I needed the quiet to think. In the afternoon, I sat in the living room with a pad of paper, mapping out my next steps. The first was to secure my accounts. The second was to find a safe place for certain documents. And the third was to decide what, if anything, I was still willing to give my children. I wrote those 3 lines and underlined them. As the sun began to dip, I stood at the window and looked out at the harbour. The water had a bronze sheen in the fading light, the kind that made the whole scene feel suspended in time. I thought about the years I had spent believing that giving was the way to hold on to the people I loved. It had never occurred to me that it might be the thing pushing them further away. I closed the notebook and placed it in the desk drawer with the envelope. This time, I locked the drawer. The small click of the lock was louder than I expected. It felt like the sound of a door closing on an old way of doing things. That night, I slept without waking. It was the first time in weeks that my mind did not replay conversations or invent explanations. In the morning, I knew I would start making the changes on that list. I did not yet know how my children would react, but for once, that was not the point. The point was that I had decided. The next morning, I moved through the house with a purpose I had not felt in a long time. The list from the day before sat on the kitchen counter, each line clear and unavoidable. I started with the hall closet, pulling out boxes I had not opened in years. Dust rose in small clouds as I lifted the lids, revealing stacks of papers, old photographs, and things that once felt too important to throw away. I carried each box to the dining table and began sorting. There were cards from birthdays long past, receipts from home repairs Donald and I had done together, and folders filled with documents that had not seen daylight in decades. I kept what mattered and set aside what could be shredded. The more I cleared, the lighter the air in the room seemed to feel. In the living room, I walked slowly around, studying the space. A few framed photos came down from the shelves, ones that no longer brought comfort. I wrapped them carefully and placed them in a box. The room looked less cluttered without them, and I noticed how the afternoon light reached further across the floor. I paused at the chow lan in the corner, its leaves glossy, but leaning away from the window. Donald had always been the one to care for it, moving it from room to room depending on the season. I lifted the pot and carried it to the sunniest window in the house. It sat there as if it had been waiting for that spot, the light catching on each leaf. The simple act of moving it felt like a quiet declaration. This space was mine, and I could decide what stayed, what was moved, and what was removed entirely. I began to see the house not just as the backdrop to my life, but as a place I could shape to reflect who I was now. In the afternoon, I took a walk through town. The streets were familiar, each storefront and corner holding memories, but I noticed how different it felt when I walked with my head up, not looking for anyone in particular. At the grocery, I bought only what I wanted for the week. No extra items for unexpected visits, no stocking the pantry for anyone else's preferences. Back home, I set the groceries away and made tea. I took it to the porch and sat in the cool air, listening to the sound of the harbour. The tide was coming in, slow and steady, and the water moved with a calm certainty that made me think about my own pace. I did not need to rush decisions. I only needed to keep moving forward. Later, I went upstairs to the small room I had once used as a reading space. Over the years, it had turned into a storage area, piled with boxes and unused furniture. I pulled open the curtains, letting in the last light of the day, and started clearing the floor. I imagined a chair in the corner, a lamp beside it, and shelves lined with the books I loved most. The picture in my mind was so clear that I found myself measuring the space before I even realized I was doing it. By evening, I had filled 3 large bags for donation and another for the trash. The rooms felt different, not just because they were less crowded, but because I could see them again. Each choice about what to keep and what to let go of was a reminder that I could do the same with the people and situations in my life. As I sat at the kitchen table that night, I looked at the envelope in the locked drawer. For the first time, it no longer felt tied to guilt or obligation. It was simply a resource, and I could choose how to use it in a way that aligned with the life I wanted now. The house was quiet, except for the faint sound of the waves carrying up from the harbour. I could feel the difference in the air. It was not just the absence of clutter. It was the absence of that old heaviness I had carried without realizing it. Before bed, I walked through the rooms once more. The spaces felt more open, more mine. In the corner of the living room, the chowlan caught the moonlight, its leaves shining softly. It seemed to stand taller already, and I understood the feeling. A few days later, I was in the kitchen wiping down the counters when my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from a neighbour who lived 2 streets over. She had sent a short note saying she thought she saw photos of my house online, staged for a property listing. My chest tightened as I read her words again. I clicked on the link she included, and there it was. The living room stripped of my bookshelves, the dining room table set as if for a magazine spread. The colours were cool and neutral, nothing like the warm tones I had lived with for decades. Even the photographs on the walls had been replaced with generic artwork. The house looked familiar and foreign at the same time, as though someone had taken the bones of it and dressed it in another life. I studied each picture slowly, noticing details that told me this was recent. The chowlan I had moved to the window was still there, its leaves catching the light in one shot, though the rest of the room bore no trace of me. My first reaction was disbelief, but it shifted quickly into something sharper. Someone had been inside my home, moving things, altering it, and then showing it to the world. The image that stayed with me most was the front porch. The rug had been replaced, the potted plants gone. It was the view I saw every morning when I stepped outside, but now it looked like it belonged to a stranger. I closed the link and sat still for a long time, my hands resting on the table. It did not take much to piece together how this had happened. The man I had seen with Lila and Brian at the community centre, the phone call I had overheard in the driveway, the way they had been so absorbed in their conversation that day. This was the next step in whatever plan they were making. I went to the hallway closet and pulled out the notepad where I had been keeping track of important details. I added the date, the link, and a description of the photos. I wrote down every change I could see in them, every small sign that someone had been inside my home without my knowledge. The act of recording it calmed me, giving shape to what I already knew in my gut. The rest of the day, I moved through the house differently. I looked at each room as if through someone else's eyes, noting what they might want to change, what they might call outdated. I saw the marks of my life everywhere, and I realized how easily they could be erased. By evening, I had made a decision. I would no longer wait for this to unfold around me. I would find out exactly what they were planning and make my own moves before theirs could take effect. I took a walk along the harbour to clear my head. The air was cool and smelled faintly of the tide. The water shifted under the fading light, boats rocking gently in their slips. It was a view I had always loved, but tonight it felt different. I could not shake the thought that someone else saw it not as a home, but as a selling point. When I returned home, I walked through each room again, this time more slowly. I noticed the faint indent in the rug where a piece of furniture had been moved. A chair in the corner sat at an angle I never left it in. These were small things, but they were proof. Someone had been here when I was not. I sat at my desk and opened the drawer where the envelope and my notebook were kept. I looked at both for a long time before closing the drawer again. The lock clicked into place, and I felt a quiet resolve settle over me. This was my home, my life, and I was done watching from the sidelines while someone else decided its future. That night, as I lay in bed, the images from the listing floated through my mind. The empty walls, the staged table, the altered porch. They were trying to take the soul out of the house to make it easier to let go. But I knew better. I had lived within these walls too long to let them be turned into nothing more than a backdrop for someone else's plans. I fell asleep knowing that the next step would be mine to take, and it would be deliberate. I would see to it that whatever came next, I would not be the one left out of the decision. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I had not felt in weeks. The decision had been forming quietly in the background, and now it stood fully in front of me. I was not going to wait for their next move. I would set my own in motion. I began by calling Patty. I kept my voice steady as I told her I was planning a small event at the old library where I had worked for so many years. It would be a community gathering, nothing elaborate, but meaningful. I wanted to invite local families, a few longtime friends, and yes, even Lila and Brian. She understood immediately without me explaining the full reason. That afternoon, I walked down to the library to speak with the current director. The space still smelled faintly of paper and polished wood, the same as it had when I was there every day. I explained that I wanted to organize a reading day for children, paired with the announcement of a small project I was starting. The director smiled, saying the calendar was open in 2 weeks and that she would help spread the word. Over the next several days, I worked quietly, making lists and planning the details. I ordered new books for the children's section, a few beanbag chairs, and small activity tables. I arranged for a local bakery to provide cookies and for Patty to help with tea and lemonade. The invitations were written by hand. I wanted them to feel personal. I included neighbours, former colleagues, parents I had met through the library over the years, and a few members of the town council. Lila and Brian each received one, sent in the same unassuming envelope as everyone else. I imagined their curiosity when they opened it. As the day approached, I made a trip into town to pick up supplies. The hardware store owner recognized me and asked about the event after seeing the list in my hand. I kept my answer light, saying only that it was a small library program. Inwardly, I felt the steady hum of anticipation. 2 days before the gathering, I walked through my house in the evening light. The staged images from the listing still lingered in my mind, but the rooms were mine again, the furniture back in place, the photographs returned to the walls. The chow lan in the window looked healthier than it had in months. I watered it slowly, letting the excess run into the saucer. The night before, I packed a box with the items I would bring to the library. Among them was a folder containing the documents I had prepared for the announcement. It was not about selling or defending property. It was about claiming my role in my own story. On the morning of the event, the harbour air was crisp, and the sky stretched clear over the water. I dressed simply, choosing a navy sweater and slacks, then loaded the box into the car. Patty was already at the library when I arrived, arranging the tables and setting out the refreshments. The new books were stacked neatly on a side table, their bright covers catching the light. As guests began to arrive, the room filled with the sound of conversation and the rustle of turning pages as children explored the reading corner. I moved from group to group, greeting each person, making sure they felt welcome. When I saw Lila and Brian come through the door, I acknowledged them with the same calm smile I gave everyone else. The children's reading session began, their voices stumbling at first and then growing more confident as they shared short passages from the books. The adults listened, some leaning against the bookshelves, others standing near the tables. When the last reader finished, I stepped forward. My voice carried easily in the quiet room as I thanked everyone for coming and spoke briefly about the importance of the library to our community. Then I shared that I had established a small community fund to support children's literacy and technology access, with the library as its first partner. I did not look directly at Lila or Brian, as I explained that part of this initiative included resources from my own home and life, redirected towards something that would outlast all of us. There was no need to elaborate further. The meaning was clear enough. Applause filled the room, warm and genuine. The children returned to their books, the adults to their conversations. I stepped back, letting the hum of the gathering surround me. It was my event, my choice, and for the first time in a long while, I felt entirely in control of the moment. By the time the last guests left and we had begun to tidy up, the light outside had softened into late afternoon. Patty caught my eye and nodded, a quiet acknowledgement that the day had gone exactly as it needed to. I carried the now empty box back to my car, the harbour breeze cool on my face, certain that whatever came next, I had already taken the first and most important step. The library was quiet, except for the soft shuffle of chairs as people settled after the children's reading session. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, laying warm rectangles across the worn, hardwood floor. I stood near the table where the new books were displayed, my hands resting lightly on the folder I had brought. I began speaking slowly, letting my voice carry without strain. I thanked the community for showing up, for continuing to believe in the power of a public space where everyone was welcome. I spoke about the importance of giving children both the tools and the encouragement to learn, about how small acts can leave lasting marks on a town like ours. Then I opened the folder and laid out the announcement. I told them that I had established a community fund for literacy and technology, one that would begin its work here at the library. I explained that this fund was not a donation made in passing, but a dedicated resource, built from things I had set aside for years and from choices I had made recently about my own life. The words were simple, but they carried more weight than I expected. I saw faces light up, a few people nodding slowly as if they understood more than what I was saying outright. I glanced briefly across the room. Lila stood near the back, her arms folded, her expression carefully neutral. Brian was beside her, his eyes fixed on the floor. I went on, outlining the first steps the fund would take: purchasing new learning materials, upgrading the library's computers, and creating a small grant program for after-school reading initiatives. I kept my tone steady, not once raising it, letting the calm certainty in my voice be the anchor for the moment. When I finished, the room was still for a beat before the applause began. It was not loud or rushed. It rolled through the space like a slow tide, warm and deliberate. The children returned to the reading corner, flipping through books with the excitement only new pages can bring. Conversations resumed in low tones, and I stepped back, letting the event breathe without pushing myself to the center again. People came forward to thank me, some shaking my hand, others simply offering a few quiet words. Patty stayed nearby, helping to guide guests toward the refreshments and making sure the atmosphere stayed light. I noticed a few members of the town council speaking to the library director with animated gestures, already discussing what might come next. Lila and Brian did not approach immediately. They lingered near the door, speaking quietly to each other. I did not strain to hear their words. There was no need. This was not a conversation I had planned to have today. The point of this gathering was not confrontation, but clarity, and I had already achieved it. As the crowd began to thin, I stepped outside for a moment. The air was crisp, the sky washed clean by the light wind that had been moving in from the harbour all day. I could hear the faint clink of the flagpole rope against its metal base and the distant call of gulls. Inside, I could still see the children bent over their books, the librarians shelving new arrivals, the quiet order of a place fulfilling its purpose. When I walked back in, Lila was standing alone by the side table. She looked up as I passed, but said nothing. Her expression held a mix of calculation and something else I could not yet read. Brian had already stepped outside, his shoulders tight as he moved toward the parking lot. I gathered my things slowly, giving the last of the guests time to finish their conversations. The library director thanked me again, her voice warm with genuine appreciation. She promised to update me on the first purchases made from the fund and invited me to stop by whenever I liked. By the time Patty and I carried the last boxes to my car, the sun was low enough to cast long shadows across the street. I closed the trunk gently, feeling the weight of the day settle into something solid. I had made my choice in full view of the people who mattered, and I had done it without raising my voice or asking for permission. Driving home along the road that followed the harbour, I caught sight of the water turning to gold in the fading light. The tide was high, the boats pulling gently against their lines. It was the same view I had seen 1,000 times, yet it felt different now. I had placed something permanent between myself and the quiet erosion that had been happening for years. When I pulled into my driveway, the house stood just as it had that morning. The porch light clicked on as I approached, and the air smelled faintly of the cedar shingles warming from the day's sun. Inside, the rooms were just as I had left them. The chowlan in the window caught the last streaks of sunlight, its leaves still reaching toward the glass. I set my keys on the table and stood there for a moment, letting the quiet wrap around me. The day had ended the way I wanted it to, with the understanding that the story was now moving on my terms. Whatever came next, the ground beneath me felt steady. 2 days after the library event, the town seemed to hum with a quieter, more attentive energy. Wherever I went, people greeted me with a certain warmth, like they had seen something they were still thinking about. At the grocery store, an older man who had never spoken more than a polite hello stopped me near the produce aisle to thank me for what I had done. At the post office, a young mother with 2 children in tow said she had signed up for the new reading program already. None of these exchanges were long, but each one carried its own weight. At home, I noticed changes in my own rhythm. The envelope that once sat on my kitchen table was gone, no longer a silent reminder of an unspoken promise. In its place was a neat stack of papers from the library board, outlining the first steps for the fund. I kept them in plain sight, not as a trophy, but as a clear record of where my choice had gone. Lila had not called. Brian had not either. That silence no longer felt like an open wound. It was something else now, something that confirmed the distance I had already learned to live with. Yet, beneath that acceptance, there was an undeniable awareness that their absence was a choice they were making every day. On Friday afternoon, Patty stopped by with a bag of fresh bread from the bakery. We sat in the kitchen, the late winter light slanting through the blinds. She told me she had overheard Lila speaking to someone outside the hardware store. It was not the details of the conversation that struck me, but the tone Patty described, clipped, defensive, as if Lila had been cornered by a truth she did not want to face. That night, I found myself thinking about the years behind us. The little ways affection had been replaced by calculation. The times I had brushed off coldness because I thought it was temporary. I realized that what happened with the engagement dinner was not a break. It was a confirmation of how far apart we had drifted. The fund had not just redirected money, it had redirected the balance of control between us. The following morning I went down to the harbour. The fishing boats were coming in, their decks wet and gleaming under the pale sun. I walked slowly along the pier, letting the smell of salt and diesel settle around me. I had been coming here since I was a teenager, first with my father, later with Donald, and in the last decade, on my own. Each visit had its own reason. Today it was simply to remind myself of what was steady and unchanging. I sat on a bench near the end of the dock, watching the water shift in soft, uneven ripples. From here, the town looked small, almost fragile. Yet I knew it had a way of holding on to stories, of remembering who had done what and why. People might not speak of things openly, but word travelled in its own quiet way. When I returned home, there was a letter in the mailbox. The handwriting was familiar, Lila's, though it had been years since she had sent me anything by post. Inside was a short note. She wrote that she had heard about the fund and that it was my decision to do as I pleased with my money. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what she had done. Only a line at the end that read, "I hope you find what you are looking for." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer where I keep other pieces of correspondence, the kind that matter enough to keep but not enough to display. Her words confirmed what I already knew. She was not ready to bridge the gap, and she might never be. That evening, I lit the small lamp in the living room and settled into my chair with a book. The house was quiet, but it did not feel empty. Outside, the wind had picked up, and I could hear it moving through the trees. There was a time when the silence after a storm would leave me restless. Now it felt like something earned, the calm that follows a decision made with clarity. I had learned that dignity is not granted by others. It is something you choose to hold, even when those closest to you try to strip it away. The fund was not just a gift to the town, it was a statement to myself. I could take what had been meant to diminish me and turn it into something enduring. By the time I went to bed, the air had grown colder, the moon casting its pale light over the harbour in the distance. I stood for a moment at the window, watching the reflection of the water shimmer. Somewhere out there, the tide was shifting again, and so was I. The week before the Library Fund's official launch, I found myself working through small but deliberate preparations. The committee had sent me a finalized agenda, along with a modest program printed on thick cream paper. My name was listed not at the top, but midway down, after the mayor and the head librarian. That suited me fine. I had no interest in being the center of the event. I only wanted it to happen, to be real and tangible. Patty stopped by one morning with 2 steaming cups of coffee and a tin of cookies she insisted I keep. She told me more people had signed up for the workshops than they had space for. The overflow would be put on a waiting list, which was both encouraging and bittersweet. It meant the need was greater than I had imagined. It also confirmed that the choice I made with that envelope had already begun to ripple outward. Outside, winter was loosening its grip. The snow that had clung stubbornly to the edges of the sidewalks was shrinking into thin grey patches. I walked through the harbour market, picking up a loaf of bread, some fresh apples, and a bouquet of tulips that caught my eye. The colours were bold and unapologetic, a reminder that life pushes forward whether we are ready or not. That evening, as I arranged the tulips in a vase, the phone rang. I recognized the number immediately. It was Brian. His voice was strained but controlled, as if he had rehearsed what he wanted to say. He had heard about the fund and wanted to make it clear that while he did not agree with my decision, he would not try to interfere. His words carried the weight of a truce neither of us had asked for. We spoke for less than 5 minutes. When the call ended, I stood for a long time in the quiet, feeling the space his voice left behind. The next few days passed in a measured rhythm. I attended the final planning meeting at the library, where the head librarian showed me the display they had set up in the main hall. There was a large photograph of the harbour taken from the pier, framed by 2 shelves of new books purchased with the first portion of the fund. Seeing it there, visible, unhidden, part of the life of the town, stirred something in me that was hard to name. On the morning of the launch, I dressed in a simple navy coat and a wool scarf, the same one I had worn on cold market days with Donald. The walk to the library felt shorter than usual, though I took my time, noticing the way sunlight filtered through the bare branches along Main Street. A few people waved as I passed. Inside, the air was warm and filled with the soft hum of conversation. I took my place toward the side, watching as the mayor spoke about the importance of community resources and the role of the library in connecting people to opportunities. The head librarian spoke next, sharing stories of patrons whose lives had been changed by access to books, classes, and a place to belong. When it was my turn, I stepped to the small podium. I spoke briefly, explaining why I believed in the library's work and how the fund was not just about books or programs, but about giving people room to grow. I did not mention the engagement party, or the envelope, or the silence from my children. This moment was not about them. It was about turning something private into something shared, and in doing so, making it stronger. After the event, people came up to shake my hand, some offering quiet thanks, others sharing their own stories of how the library had touched their lives. Each one felt like a piece of the story now belonged to more than just me. That night, I sat in my living room with the tulips now fully open on the table beside me. The petals were wide and vivid, their edges beginning to curl slightly, as if they were settling into themselves. I realized that, like the flowers, I had moved through stages, from a closed and guarded place to one that could stand in the open, even if only for a time. The silence from Lila and Brian still lingered, but it no longer dictated the tone of my days. I had chosen to fill that space with something else, something that would last beyond whatever distance remained between us. And in that choice, I had found a kind of steadiness I had not felt in years. Spring arrived quietly, without the fanfare I used to expect from the seasons. The harbour was still and silver in the mornings, the gulls gliding low over the water. I found myself walking there most days, not for any reason other than to breathe in the open air and remind myself that life was bigger than the walls of my home. The library fund had settled into its own steady rhythm. I received updates from Patty about new programs starting and small thank you notes from people who had taken classes. I kept them in a simple wooden box on my desk. It was not wealth in the way my children understood it, but it was a kind of return I could feel in my bones. One afternoon, I saw Lila across the market. She noticed me too. For a moment, our eyes met. There was no anger in hers, but there was no welcome either. She gave a small nod and turned back to the stall of fresh herbs. I walked past without stopping. It did not hurt the way it once would have. Some things remain unsaid, not because they do not matter, but because saying them will not change what they are. At home, I boiled water for tea and opened the kitchen window. The sound of children playing drifted in from down the street. Their laughter was sharp and bright, carrying over the low hum of traffic. I thought about how my life had been shaped by my choices, the deliberate ones and the ones I had been pushed into. I had learned that keeping dignity intact sometimes meant stepping back, letting go of what could not be repaired. It did not mean giving up. It meant deciding where my presence, my care, and my resources could do the most good. And I had done that. That evening, I sat at the table with a pen and a fresh piece of paper. I wrote out instructions for the fund, making sure it would remain strong long after I was gone. I placed the paper in the box with the thank you notes, closing the lid with a quiet sense of completion. The sun was dipping low, casting a warm light over the harbour outside my window. I realized then that I was no longer waiting for an apology that might never come. I was no longer holding my breath for something to return to how it once was. I had found a new shape for my life, one that fit me now. And as the sky shifted into a soft blue-grey, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not triumph, not victory, but peace, the kind that settles quietly and stays. This story is not only about loss or family conflict. It is about finding the strength to define your life on your own terms, even when the people you love cannot or will not meet you there. Have you ever had to choose peace over keeping a relationship at any cost, knowing it was the only way to protect your dignity and your heart? If this story reminded you of your own journey or gave you strength to take a step forward, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes, hope begins in the quietest of places.